Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the fastest collapses in modern military history, the fall of France in 1940. Imagine it, one of Europe's greatest powers, proud of its victory in the First World War, boasting millions of soldiers, thick fortifications, and an empire that spanned continents. Yet in just 6 short weeks, it all came crashing down. You can almost hear the disbelief of onlookers from London to Washington. France has fallen? Already? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can smell the oil and diesel as French trucks roar north in panic. It's May 1940. And somewhere along the River Meuse, a thin mist clings to the trees. You see the silhouettes of French infantry huddled beside their tanks, waiting for orders that never seem to come. Overhead, the Luftwaffe drones on, a constant growl that turns men's spines to ice. Within days, columns of German panzers spear through the Ardennes forest, a region French high command had labeled impassable. It's like watching a magician reach through a locked box and pull out your watch before you even notice. To an outsider, it feels like France just gave up. But beneath that surface of sudden defeat lies a labyrinth of deeper failures, economic, political, and doctrinal, that had been eating away at the Republic for decades. The German invasion was merely the spark. The powder keg had been there all along. France in 1940 wasn't a weak state by numbers. It had more tanks than Germany, nearly as many aircraft, and an army that had once stopped the Kaiser dead in his tracks. Its fortifications, especially the Maginot Line, were marvels of engineering. You could take a nap inside one of those underground bunkers and forget a world war was raging outside. Yet somehow, this very strength became its weakness. The country had built a fortress for yesterday's war, not tomorrow's. Historians still argue whether the French collapse was inevitable or preventable. Was it poor leadership? A flawed strategy? A nation too weary to fight another war? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. What we do know is that the mindset of France after 1918 was a cocktail of pride and paranoia. The Great War had scarred the national psyche so deeply that never again became an obsession, and ironically, ensured that history repeated itself. You can almost imagine a French officer in the 1930s staring across the Maginot Line and thinking, "Let the next war come to us. We'll be ready." But wars never come the same way twice. At the heart of the collapse lay 3 interlocking problems. First, the economy. France had emerged from World War I victorious but hollowed out. Millions dead, regions devastated, industry shattered. While Germany, the supposed loser, rebuilt with ruthless focus during the 1930s, France struggled with strikes, inflation, and political infighting. Its factories couldn't match the tempo of rearmament that Hitler demanded of his own. Even when French engineers designed brilliant tanks like the Saumur S-35 or the Char B-1, they produced them in boutique numbers, like handcrafted watches in a world moving toward assembly lines. Second, the political system. The Third Republic was famously unstable. Dozens of governments came and went in the 1930s, some lasting mere months. Ministers fought over budgets, generals argued over doctrine, and everyone distrusted everyone else. Civilian leaders feared a military coup. The military despised amateur politicians meddling in strategy. It was like watching a 3-legged race where each runner insisted on going a different direction. And third, the military philosophy. The French command structure, steeped in the trauma of Verdun, believed that defense was the only sane policy. They envisioned the next war as a slow, grinding repetition of trenches and artillery duels. Their solution was to dig in, to plan, to fortify, to control every inch of the battlefield from a command post far behind the lines. German generals, meanwhile, were planning to drive tanks through forests and radio their way to Paris. One of the more bizarre quirks of the time, the French army still used pigeons for battlefield messages in 1940. Not as backup, actively. While German officers carried portable radios, some French units relied on actual birds to deliver reports. Historians still chuckle about this, though the French insist it wasn't as silly as it sounds. Pigeons can't be jammed after all. Still, symbolism matters. The difference between a pigeon and a panzer network says everything about the two armies' mindsets. One clung to the safe and familiar. The other experimented, adapted, and improvised. Now picture the French public. Many were still traumatized from 1918, haunted by the endless lists of the dead, the crippled veterans selling pencils on Parisian sidewalks. The nation wanted peace, stability, maybe a good glass of wine and a Sunday in the countryside. When Hitler began annexing neighbors, the average French citizen didn't want another showdown. They trusted their government to manage things, just as they'd trusted it to build the Maginot Line. A defensive masterpiece meant no one would have to die in muddy fields again. But behind closed doors, cracks widened. France's leaders couldn't even agree on who the real enemy was. The far left saw fascism as a capitalist disease. The far right saw communism as the true menace. And when you can't agree on who to fear, you end up fearing everyone. Meanwhile, in Germany, things were terrifyingly efficient. Hitler's regime had consolidated power, rearmed in secret, and trained an officer corps obsessed with speed, coordination, and shock. When France declared war in 1939 after the invasion of Poland, its army mobilized but barely moved. The phony war, as the British called it, lasted months. Troops sat idle behind fortifications, reading newspapers and playing cards, while German divisions rehearsed the greatest military ambush of the century. And yet, here's the irony, you can't even call the French soldiers cowards. They fought bravely in countless places, at Stone, at Hanu, around Sedan. Entire battalions held their ground until ammunition ran out. But bravery without coordination is just noise. 100 small fires can't replace one blazing torch. By June, the shockwaves of defeat had rippled through every level of French society. Refugees clogged the roads, clogging supply lines and morale alike. Planes strafed columns of civilians, spreading panic and confusion. French officers tried to form new defensive lines, but orders changed faster than they could be printed. The enemy wasn't just across the river, it was inside the system. Historians still debate the moment France truly lost the war. Some point to the breakthrough at Sedan, others to the encirclement at Dunkirk, others still to the psychological collapse of the government itself. But one thing is certain, when your entire national philosophy is built around not losing again, you tend to stop thinking about how to win. And so, the country that had once marched triumphantly into Berlin in 1919 now found itself signing an armistice in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered 22 years earlier. Poetic justice, Hitler thought. Historical humiliation, the French whispered. But that's the end of the story. We're still at the beginning. Because to truly understand why France fell, you need to look not at the battlefield, but at the decades leading up to it. The ghosts of Verdun, the politicians with trembling hands, the generals who trusted cement more than imagination. And you, sitting there in the dark, might wonder what any of this has to do with you. Maybe more than you think. Every empire, every institution, every person, really, faces that same danger. The comfort of thinking past victories guarantee future safety. Next, you'll step back in time to the trenches of the Great War, where the roots of France's 1940 collapse were planted in the mud of 1916. The mud sticks to your boots long before the shooting starts. You're back in 1916 now, at Verdun, France's beating, bleeding heart. The air smells like cordite and damp wool. The ground shakes. The sky is ash. And the world has shrunk to trenches, rats, and prayers. You trudge through the claustrophobic maze of duckboards and sandbags, past men whose faces are ghost pale beneath grime. They mutter, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. And they didn't. Verdun held, but at a price so unbearable that it would haunt every French officer, every planner, and every citizen for a generation. France lost nearly 1 million men in that war, its youth decimated. Imagine an entire generation wiped out, the future amputated. Every family had someone who didn't come home. In 1919, victory parades marched through Paris, flags waved, cannons fired, and generals saluted. But underneath that triumph lay something quieter, darker, exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with medals or speeches. That's the starting point for everything that followed. Because the France that emerged from the First World War wasn't the same country that had entered it. It was older, more cautious, more bureaucratic, and above all, terrified of reliving the nightmare. When people call the 1920s France's lost decade, they don't mean economically. They mean psychologically. Even as the economy stumbled through recovery, society remained frozen. The French soldier, once the daring poilu charging across no man's land, became a symbol of stoic endurance, not bold initiative. Heroism had been replaced by trauma. So when the army began planning for future wars, its thinkers naturally clung to what had worked: attrition, defense, and careful calculation. You can almost hear an old general saying, "We won by holding, not by running." And that belief hardened into doctrine. Historians still argue whether Verdun saved France or doomed it. Yes, it prevented defeat in 1916, but it also convinced French leaders that endurance alone wins wars. That mindset, glorifying patience and control, would later prove fatal. Meanwhile, the ghosts of Verdun haunted politics too. Veterans returned home disillusioned, forming leagues and movements across the spectrum. Some leaned left, preaching pacifism and socialism. Others drifted right, dreaming of strongmen to restore order. Street clashes became routine in Paris. Everyone claimed to speak for the fallen of Verdun, even as they shouted past one another. That divide bred paralysis. When every policy must honor the dead, risk-taking becomes sacrilege. That's why, by the late 1920s, France was more obsessed with memorials than modernization. The government built monuments faster than tanks. Engineers proposed bold new armored doctrines, but budgets went instead to marble cenotaphs and reconstruction grants for ruined villages. Noble intentions, disastrous priorities. One quirky fact: in the 1930s, France had a nationwide movement to plant peace trees. Children in schools would gather to dedicate saplings to peace and disarmament. Sweet, touching, and tragically naive in a decade when Hitler was rearming across the Rhine. It's the kind of gesture that shows a nation desperate to believe the world could be reasonable again. Even the Maginot Line, that concrete marvel, was less a military decision than a psychological one. Politicians sold it as a guarantee, an iron promise that Verdun would never happen again. In a way, it was France's national therapy project. "We'll bury our trauma in reinforced concrete," they might as well have said. And honestly, who could blame them? You would have wanted the same if you'd seen 1916 up close. The problem wasn't that the French were cowards. It was that they were too human. They feared suffering so much that they built a strategy around avoiding it. But war doesn't care about your coping mechanisms. As you move through the 1920s, you see the patterns set. Every major military reform met resistance from those who said, "Better safe than sorry." And safe meant static. The Army's theoretical journals debated motorization and mobility, but the generals clung to the idea that wars are won by artillery and discipline, not engines and speed. When Charles de Gaulle published his 1934 book, The Army of the Future, advocating for concentrated armored forces and offensive mobility, most of his superiors dismissed him as a dreamer. Some even called him le tanquiste romantique, Romantic, yes, but also prophetic. By contrast, Germany's own military intellectuals, many of whom had read the same books, took the opposite lesson. They believed the horrors of the Great War showed not that offense was futile, but that offense had been poorly executed. While the French vowed, never again, the Germans whispered, next time, faster. You can see how differently the two nations processed the same trauma. France built walls. Germany built engines. France sought peace through permanence. Germany sought victory through motion. And then came the Great Depression, a disaster that compounded France's caution. Economic instability convinced the public that defense spending must focus on security, not adventure. The left demanded disarmament. The right demanded walls. And the middle just wanted calm. By the time France realized that Hitler wasn't bluffing, it had already lost the strategic initiative. Even its alliances reflected Verdun's shadow. France built a little entente with Eastern European states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. But these were defensive pacts, symbolic shields more than swords. France didn't envision rushing east to aid them. It envisioned holding the line while someone else did. When Germany eventually absorbed those allies one by one, France barely blinked. The trauma of 1916 whispered, "Stay behind the walls." One of the saddest ironies? French school books in the 1930s still glorified trench life as the nation's proudest moment. Children learned about heroic last stands, not bold offensives. The entire culture marinated in nostalgia for a static victory. By 1940, that mindset had become a national reflex, slow to adapt, quick to fortify, allergic to improvisation. Still, not everyone agreed. Younger officers in the 1930s tried to break the spell. Some pushed for armored divisions that could move independently, using radios and speed like the Germans would later do, but the old guard crushed their enthusiasm. Tanks were to support infantry, not lead them. Orders were to wait for artillery preparation, not act on initiative. The result? A beautiful army on paper and a disaster in motion. Historians still debate whether this conservatism was purely emotional or institutional. Was it about honoring Verdun or about generals protecting their careers? Probably both. Bureaucracies love predictability, and Verdun had made predictability sacred. And so, when war finally returned in 1939, France marched to the front not with a roar, but with a sigh. Soldiers trudged into Belgium, dug shallow trenches, set up cafes, and waited. They called it the drôle de guerre, the funny war. Nothing happened for months. Radios played jazz, newspapers printed crossword puzzles. But somewhere deep inside, the ghost of Verdun stirred uneasily. Because if history loves anything, it's repetition. You can almost picture the spectral outline of a trench soldier watching over those idle troops in 1939, whispering, "You've learned nothing." The truth is, Verdun didn't just scar France, it rewired it. The battlefield became a national religion. Safety became a virtue. And while Germany prepared to gamble everything on speed, France prepared to survive another siege. You lean back, the hum of the fan steadying your thoughts, and realize something haunting. Sometimes survival itself becomes the trap. France survived Verdun, yes, but that survival taught it all the wrong lessons for the next war. Next, you'll step into the fragile 1930s, where France's economy limped forward on tired legs, and money, not courage, became its first line of defense. The 1930s dawn, and you can almost feel the fatigue seeping out of every cobblestone in Paris. France has survived one world war, but it's like a patient who's never truly healed. Factories hum unevenly, rail lines creak under neglect, and whole regions still bear the scars of shellfire 20 years old. You wander through the industrial city of Lille, smokestacks idle, workers loitering in cafes, talking about layoffs. The Great War might be over, but the bill is still being paid, with interest. France's economic weakness wasn't dramatic or glamorous. It was slow, bureaucratic, and invisible, like rust. Between 1919 and 1939, the French economy grew, yes, but haltingly, rebuilding the Northeast, paying war reparations, and caring for widows and veterans drained the treasury. The government leaned heavily on loans and printing presses, triggering inflation. And every time the currency wobbled, the political class panicked, cutting spending just when the nation needed investment. It's easy to forget that in the early 20th century, France had been a banking powerhouse. Its investors financed railroads in Russia and canals in Egypt. But by the 1930s, that confidence had evaporated. Industrial modernization lagged behind Britain and far behind Germany or the United States. French factories were small, family-run, often scattered across rural towns. Their owners resisted consolidation or mechanization, fearing unions, taxes, or simply change itself. Historians still debate whether this was a symptom of French bourgeois conservatism or just bad timing. Either way, when Hitler began rearming Germany at breakneck speed, France was caught flat-footed. Here's a quirky detail. In 1938, the average French factory employed fewer than 50 workers. In Germany, that number was more than double. Scale mattered. Big factories meant fast output, centralized design, streamlined logistics. In France, tanks were built like wine barrels, one at a time, with artisanal pride and bureaucratic delays. The result? Machines of superb craftsmanship that arrived months late and in limited quantities. You picture a French engineer in Dijon polishing the armor plates of a Char B1 tank, proud of its thick steel and perfect welds, while across the Rhine, German engineers are churning out dozens of lighter panzers a week. Not perfect, but plentiful. The French valued quality, the Germans, momentum. And in war, momentum usually wins. It wasn't just production, it was investment. France hoarded its wealth in land and savings accounts. The French middle class distrusted the stock market, scarred by the crashes of the 1920s. So while America built skyscrapers and Germany built tanks, France built savings bonds. Economically, the nation was living in the past, a country of smallholders and shopkeepers, not industrialists and innovators. By the mid-1930s, this economic caution turned into paralysis. The Great Depression hit late, but hard. Exports collapsed, unemployment soared, and strikes rolled through major cities. Governments came and went, each promising reform, each afraid to touch the core issue: inefficiency. You could feel the fear in Parliament's speeches. Every attempt at stimulus was met with cries of, "We can't afford it," though, ironically, they couldn't afford not to. The Popular Front government of 1936, led by Léon Blum, was perhaps the last real attempt to modernize through social reform. Blum's coalition of socialists, radicals, and labor unions passed laws for paid vacations, 40-hour work weeks, and collective bargaining. Progressive, humane, and deeply controversial. Workers cheered, employers panicked. Many factory owners responded not by modernizing, but by slowing production or moving money abroad. France's fragile industry sputtered even further. Historians still argue whether Blum's reforms strengthened or weakened the nation. Some say they boosted morale and social justice. Others claim they demoralized business and gutted output at the worst possible time. Either way, by 1938, France's rearmament was running on fumes. And here's a detail that's almost absurdly symbolic. During the late 1930s, France produced over 200 different models of trucks for the army. 200, each requiring its own parts, manuals, and maintenance systems. It's like running a marathon in mismatched shoes. Meanwhile, Germany had standardized nearly everything. A mechanic in the Wehrmacht could service almost any vehicle on the front. A French mechanic might spend days just figuring out which wrench fit the model in front of him. You can see the pattern emerging. Complexity without coordination. the same pattern that plagued French politics and the military. Every region, every ministry, every industrial syndicate wanted control. No one wanted to streamline. This bureaucratic sprawl was fueled by a cultural trait both admirable and deadly: France's love of debate. Every issue became a discussion, every decision a compromise, every compromise a delay. Meetings multiplied, results evaporated. And war, as the Germans would soon prove, rewards decisiveness over perfection. Still, despite the mess, France wasn't defenseless. By 1939, it had roughly 3,000 tanks, more than Germany. It had good aircraft, on paper. It had skilled engineers, brave pilots, experienced generals. But converting potential into performance required coordination and willpower, and both were in short supply. Money played a cruel trick on psychology, too. Because France had such deep financial reserves, it mistook solvency for security. "We can afford to wait," politicians said. But waiting doesn't strengthen you when your opponent is sprinting. Even the empire couldn't save things. France's colonial possessions, stretching from North Africa to Indochina, looked impressive on a map, but contributed little to industrial war. Colonial troops were brave, yes, but equipping and transporting them across oceans required a logistical sophistication France no longer had. One odd little episode. In 1937, a group of officers proposed setting up armored divisions in North Africa to train under desert conditions, predicting that mobile warfare would dominate the next conflict. Paris rejected the idea. It was too expensive and unnecessary. 2 years later, German tanks would roar across France faster than any desert wind. And then there was the stock market crash of 1938. The franc devalued again, investors fled, and military budgets were slashed just as rearmament was gaining traction. The French Air Force, in particular, suffered. Production quotas were reduced, and the government nationalized several aircraft firms to simplify coordination. In reality, that created new bureaucratic tangles and political infighting over contracts. You can imagine the frustration of a young engineer trying to get parts for a fighter plane while waiting for 3 ministries to sign off. The sense of urgency that defined Germany's Luftwaffe simply didn't exist in France. Still, one could argue that economics alone didn't doom the nation. After all, the Soviet Union was poorer and yet held out for years against Germany. What France lacked wasn't just money, it was confidence. Economic weakness seeps into morale like damp into walls. By 1939, many French citizens had internalized a quiet fatalism. They didn't trust their leaders, didn't believe in victory, and didn't feel united. The idea of another long war felt unbearable. You could sense it in letters, in songs, in the way people talked about if war comes, not when. There's an eerie statistic historians love to cite. Between 1936 and 1939, the French army's desertion rate during peacetime exercises doubled. Not because soldiers were cowards, but because they were confused, unsure what or who they were fighting for. And that brings you to the strange paradox of pre-war France, a nation rich in potential, but poor in spirit. Its fields were fertile, its engineers brilliant, its soldiers disciplined, but its heart was tired. You glance across the metaphorical map and see the contrast. Germany's economy thrummed with manic energy, driven by rearmament and ideology. Britain's economy pivoted toward total war production. France's economy held meetings. By the eve of 1940, the difference between the two systems was visible not in spreadsheets, but in momentum. Germany could mobilize entire divisions in days. France needed weeks. And when speed is the currency of survival, bureaucracy is bankruptcy. Yet, amid all this gloom, there were glimmers of brilliance. Companies like Renault, Hispano-Suiza, and WWII still built world-class machines. The Char B-1 tank could shred a panzer in one-on-one combat. French artillery remained among the best in Europe, but tools without strategy are just expensive toys. Historians still debate whether France could have rearmed successfully with different leadership or timing. Maybe, they say, if Blum's reforms had lasted longer, or if conservatives had embraced modernization instead of fearing it. But history doesn't deal in ifs, only in momentum. And by 1940, France's momentum was all downhill. You lean back again, imagining the quiet ticking of a clock in a Paris ministry office. Papers piled high, typewriters clacking, men in suits debating budgets while thunder gathers over the Rhine. Somewhere, a young officer sketches a plan for a new armored corps that no one will ever fund. The fan in your room hums like a faraway engine, and for a moment, you can almost hear the future roaring toward them. Next, we'll step into the political maze of the Third Republic, where cabinets fell faster than German paratroopers and unity became a luxury France could no longer afford. You're sitting in a smoky Paris cafe in 1934. The coffee's cold, the air's thick with arguments, and the newspapers scream headlines about another government collapse. Someone mutters, "That's the fifth one this year." You look around, and no one even reacts. In France's Third Republic, governments fall like autumn leaves. It's not a crisis, it's just Tuesday. From 1919 to 1940, France cycled through more than 40 governments. Ministers came and went faster than uniforms could be laundered. Cabinets lasted months, sometimes weeks. Political parties splintered and reformed, each one convinced the others were either fascists or communists, or both. Democracy survived, technically, but just barely, wobbling on exhausted legs. Historians still argue whether the Third Republic's instability was a symptom of democracy's vitality or its sickness. Some call it proof of pluralism, others call it organized chaos. But for the generals and bureaucrats tasked with preparing for war, it was a nightmare. You can't plan a 10-year defense policy when your Minister of War might resign by spring. Every major decision, budgeting, doctrine, industrial contracts, was entangled in politics. Left-wing parties feared militarism. Right-wing parties feared socialism. Centrist coalitions, those fragile marriages of convenience, usually collapsed over who got which portfolio. The result was paralysis. Imagine being a French general trying to modernize the army. You request funding for armored divisions. The War Ministry says they'll consider it after the next election. Then the government falls, and the next minister has his own priorities. By the time approval comes, it's 2 years later. The budget's changed, and the equipment's outdated. That was France's rhythm. Delay, debate, derail. At the core of the chaos lay something uniquely French, an almost philosophical distrust of authority. After all, this was a country born from revolution, where suspicion of strong leaders was practically patriotic. The memory of Napoleon's empire still haunted the Republic. Every time a charismatic general rose too high, politicians panicked. They didn't want another Bonaparte on horseback storming into Paris. So they built safeguards, civilian oversight committees, bureaucratic checks, endless procedures to make sure no single figure could dominate. It sounded noble in principle. In practice, it turned the chain of command into spaghetti. Decisions had to pass through so many desks that urgency suffocated beneath paperwork. You picture it. An urgent report from the front desk of a regiment, crawling its way up through 3 offices, 4 signatures, and a debate in the Chamber of Deputies. By the time approval returns, the situation has changed. It's like trying to steer a battleship with a committee of rowers, each pulling in a different direction. The political atmosphere of the 1930s only worsened things. The Great Depression cracked open France's already fragile social order. Strikes, protests, and violent street clashes erupted regularly. Communists and royalists brawled outside Parliament. In 1934, far-right demonstrators even tried to storm the chamber itself, an eerie rehearsal for future coups elsewhere in Europe. It wasn't just instability, it was fear. The right feared revolution, the left feared dictatorship. In that mutual terror, compromise died. The army, which should have been neutral, became politicized too. Conservative officers distrusted the socialist governments, accusing them of pacifism bordering on treason. Meanwhile, leftist politicians suspected the army of monarchist sympathies. In this tug-of-war, discipline suffered. Soldiers were taught loyalty to the Republic, but what that meant depended on who defined it that month. Generals found themselves defending not just France's borders, but their own reputations in front of parliamentary committees. Here's a strange tidbit. During the 1930s, French officers were required to sign official declarations of political neutrality. But intelligence reports later revealed many secretly belonged to partisan circles. Even the intelligence services themselves, the Deuxième Bureau, were infiltrated by both right-wing nationalists and communist sympathizers. It was like having two spies sitting at the same table, each pretending not to see the other. And hovering over it all was bureaucracy's strangest invention, the Conseil supérieur de la guerre, a council that theoretically directed all military planning. In reality, it was a talking shop where senior generals politely agreed to do nothing. They met, they discussed, they drafted long memoranda, and then waited for civilian ministries to rubber stamp them. One historian famously described France's defense establishment of the 1930s as an orchestra with no conductor, all first violins. Everyone had rank, no one had power. There's an almost comedic story that makes the point. In 1938, a general proposed creating a rapid response armored corps stationed behind the Ardennes, the same forest Germany would later use for its surprise attack. His proposal was rejected by the War Ministry, not because it was tactically unsound, but because it required interdepartmental coordination between two different budget committees that refused to meet. So they didn't. Bureaucracy literally blocked foresight. Still, this wasn't simple incompetence. There was logic behind the madness. France's politicians remembered how military leaders had nearly hijacked the Republic during the Dreyfus affair decades earlier. They genuinely feared giving the army too much independence. They wanted control, and in a democracy, that instinct makes sense. But they took it to an extreme. Every new government replaced key military staff, each wanting their men in top positions. Continuity was sacrificed to politics. General Gamelin, for instance, the man who would lead France's army in 1940, was appointed as much for his political reliability as for his military skill. His calm demeanor reassured nervous ministers. He was a safe pair of hands, which in pre-war France was code for won't make waves. But wars are not won by safe pairs of hands. Meanwhile, across the border, the contrast was stunning. Hitler's regime concentrated power ruthlessly. The Wehrmacht had one Führer, one chain of command, one direction. Every division understood the plan. In France, a colonel might receive orders from two ministries, three departments, and a superior who wasn't sure which line of authority actually applied. Historians still debate whether this bureaucratic micromanagement was worse than outright authoritarianism. Would you rather risk dictatorship or disorganization? France chose the latter, and it cost them everything. You can sense the cultural irony. The same system that valued liberty and debate became trapped by its own virtues. Meetings stretched longer, decisions slowed further, and every layer of oversight added new friction. And then there was morale. Civilian control didn't just shape command, it shaped spirit. By the late 1930s, the French public had grown wary of generals altogether. The army was seen less as a heroic institution and more as a necessary expense. Newspapers ran exposés on wasteful defense contracts. Scandals over embezzlement and procurement plagued headlines. When officers called for reforms, the public shrugged. Another general asking for more toys, people said. Even propaganda suffered. Germany flooded its citizens with messages of unity and destiny. France's messages were about caution and vigilance. It's hard to rally a nation around the slogan, "We're prepared to endure." And yet, deep inside this web of politics and paperwork, there were genuine patriots, officers and civil servants who saw the storm coming. Some tried desperately to reform from within, warning that the next war wouldn't be a repeat of 1914, but their voices drowned in parliamentary noise. France was trapped in its own system, democratic in spirit, bureaucratic in function, indecisive in crisis. There's a telling moment from 1939. As war loomed, a parliamentary committee debated whether to mobilize industry for full war production. The session ran 5 hours. At the end, they postponed the decision, pending further study. 2 weeks later, Hitler invaded Poland. By the time France declared war, its political machinery was still debating the fine print of factory contracts. You lean back in your chair, the cafe lights dimming, the sound of rain on cobblestones outside. You can almost see it now, the pattern emerging. A nation brilliant at ideas, strangled by its own caution. A country that distrusted power so much, it forgot how to use it.
And you can't help but think, maybe the real tragedy wasn't that France lacked courage, but that it had too much fear of repeating its past mistakes. Its leaders were haunted not just by 1914, but by 1793, by coups and emperors and lost republics. To them, caution was patriotism. And in peacetime, that's a virtue. But in 1940, it would be suicide. Next, you'll watch how that same bureaucracy crept directly into the barracks, where generals became administrators and soldiers found themselves obeying accountants. You're in a dimly lit operations room at Vincennes, just outside Paris. The walls are covered with maps, and cigarette smoke curls in the air like lazy ghosts. Men in uniform murmur over tables, not with urgency, but with bureaucracy, checking forms, verifying signatures, measuring every decision in triplicate. It feels less like a war room and more like a tax office with better decor. This is how France prepared for the next World War, through layers of paper, committees, and protocol. It's not that they didn't care, it's that they cared too much about procedure. By the late 1930s, the French military machine had become entangled in red tape so dense that even routine maneuvers required political clearance. Every operation had to be harmonized across ministries, every expenditure justified before multiple councils. The War Ministry, the General Staff, the Ministry of Finance, and sometimes even Parliament itself all wanted a say. In theory, this ensured accountability. In reality, it ensured paralysis. You can almost hear the frustration of officers in the field. "Why must I request fuel through 3 departments?" one colonel complained in 1939. "By the time I receive approval, the battle will have ended, perhaps with me in it." Historians still debate the origins of this bureaucratic stranglehold. Some say it was rooted in the Republican fear of military coups. Others trace it to the trauma of World War I, when civilian oversight was credited with saving the Republic from generals who wanted to dictate peace. Whatever the cause, by 1940, France's command system had all the flexibility of a marble statue. Even simple things, like moving units, required endless forms. One particularly absurd anecdote: an officer during the early days of the German invasion needed permission to relocate artillery batteries a few kilometers west to avoid air attack. The request bounced between commands for 48 hours. By the time approval arrived, the batteries had already been destroyed. It would be funny if it weren't tragic. The system turned capable officers into paper pushers. Generals like Maurice Gamelin, cautious and cerebral, spent more time reviewing staff memos than touring the front. He preferred to command from his headquarters near Paris, 60 miles behind the line, connected by telephone to subordinates who were themselves buried under layers of staff. In theory, this was centralized coordination. In practice, it was telephone tag with tanks. Meanwhile, across the border, German generals were in their panzers, radios crackling, adapting, minute by minute. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. One quirky fact that perfectly captures this mentality: during maneuvers in 1938, a French division was docked points for over-initiative.
A colonel had adjusted his deployment to exploit a local weakness without explicit approval. He was reprimanded, not for failure, but for acting too independently. The lesson was clear: obey first, think later. The philosophy behind this rigidity was known as méthodique bataille, the methodical battle. It taught that victory came from perfect planning and synchronization, not spontaneity. Every movement was to be timed, calculated, and executed like clockwork. The goal was to remove uncertainty from war, an admirable fantasy, but a fantasy nonetheless. Historians still argue whether méthodique bataille was a response to World War I's chaos or simply an excuse for inflexibility. Whatever its intent, it stifled the very creativity modern warfare demanded. It wasn't just strategy, it was culture. The French army prized order and intellectualism. Staff officers were chosen for their academic brilliance, not their daring. They wrote impeccable reports, filled with precise grammar and cautious conclusions. A German general once joked that the French produced the best paperwork in Europe. If wars were won by filing cabinets, they'd rule the world. Inside the ranks, initiative was quietly discouraged. Young officers who showed too much ambition risked being labeled undisciplined. Promotion favored seniority, not talent. The same men who'd commanded divisions in 1918 still dominated in 1940, their minds fossilized in trench war thinking. And yet, beneath this hierarchy, there were voices of rebellion. Charles de Gaulle, still a relatively obscure colonel, warned that war was changing. He saw tanks and aircraft not as auxiliary tools, but as the future of decisive warfare. His 1934 book, Vers l'armée de métier, Toward a Professional Army, argued for fully mechanized divisions capable of independent operations. The High Command dismissed him as too theoretical. One superior quipped, "De Gaulle dreams of nightly charges with machines." Ironically, those machines would soon roll across his country, but under German flags. Bureaucratic control extended beyond the army into defense industries too. The Ministry of Armaments micromanaged production schedules, insisting on perfect cost accounting instead of rapid output. Engineers had to file reports before implementing even minor design changes. When one company suggested simplifying a tank model to speed production, the request took 9 months to clear committee review. 9 months for a bolt redesign. If you think that's exaggerated, consider this. Between 1936 and 1939, the French aircraft industry underwent 3 separate nationalizations and reorganizations. Each transition froze production for weeks while new managers were appointed and old contracts renegotiated. By the time the Messerschmitt Bf 109s filled European skies, French factories were still arguing over budget codes. Even during the phony war period, September 1939 to May 1940, this obsession with order persisted. Soldiers dug trenches along the German border, echoes of 1914, while supply officers debated ration standards and quartermasters complained about uniform specifications. Somewhere, a committee was probably still deciding whether khaki or horizon blue would look better on victory posters. The tragedy was that these men weren't incompetent. They were intelligent, disciplined, and patriotic, but they were trapped in a system that equated caution with professionalism. When everything must be approved, nothing bold survives. A strange story circulated among officers in 1940. One general reportedly asked his staff for a Plan B in case of a breakthrough. The reply came days later, neatly typed. No Plan B authorized under current doctrine. You can almost hear the silence that followed. Civilian ministries made things worse. The War Ministry frequently overruled operational proposals, citing budgetary or political concerns. The Minister of Finance, for instance, once delayed the purchase of radios for armor units, arguing that existing signal methods are sufficient for defensive operations. Those methods included runners and telephones. excellent for 1918, suicidal for 1940. Historians still debate who is more to blame, the civilians who interfered or the generals who allowed it. The answer is probably both. Each distrusted the other so deeply that collaboration became impossible. The result was a military command frozen in fear of mistakes. Meanwhile, morale at the lower levels frayed. Soldiers noticed the inefficiency and joked bitterly about it. "Our rifles will fire once the paperwork's approved," they laughed. But the humor masked unease. The rank and file could sense that the people in charge were lost in meetings instead of leading.
Here's an anecdote that feels almost symbolic. When German forces finally broke through the Ardennes in May 1940, communications between French army groups collapsed within hours. Reports came in confused and contradictory. Rather than empower local commanders to act, Gamelin's headquarters ordered everyone to await clarification. By the time orders were clarified, the Germans were halfway to the Channel. You lean back and picture the absurdity. French officers squinting at telegraphs while panzers thunder past. The enemy moved like water. France moved like molasses. And yet, from another angle, you can almost sympathize. These men had lived through one apocalypse already. They'd seen what happened when generals acted rashly, so they built a system that made rashness impossible. But in removing chaos, they removed adaptability too. There's an old military saying, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." The French command in 1940 built a plan that couldn't even survive contact with itself. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Fear turned into structure, and structure turned into paralysis. Every decision, economic, political, military, followed the same rhythm. The entire nation moved cautiously, methodically, predictably, right into the path of the storm. You glance at the wall clock, listening to its slow, deliberate ticking, and it feels almost poetic. France was waiting for permission to fight, while history gave no extensions. Next, you'll step inside the concrete corridors of the Maginot Line, the pride of France's defensive obsession, and discover how steel and stone became monuments to misplaced faith. You run your hand along cool concrete. The air smells faintly of oil and damp metal. Somewhere down the corridor, a generator hums softly, its steady pulse echoing through miles of fortified tunnels. You are inside the Maginot Line, France's ultimate promise to itself that the horrors of Verdun would never return. It's the 1930s, and the world above is nervous. Germany is rearming, Italy is flexing, Spain is burning. But down here, in this underground labyrinth stretching from Luxembourg to Switzerland, everything feels safe. Cafeterias serve hot meals, bunk beds line immaculate barracks, and artillery turrets rotate with mechanical precision. There are theaters, radio rooms, even wine cellars. One soldier later recalled it felt like living in a small, well-armed city underground. This was France's masterpiece, the Ligne Maginot, named after André Maginot, the Minister of War who'd championed it after World War I. It wasn't just a fortification, it was therapy in concrete. The Maginot Line embodied France's trauma and its hope, built on the conviction that technology and engineering could neutralize fear itself. The logic behind it seemed flawless. If the Germans ever attacked again, they'd smash headlong into an impregnable wall. France would absorb the blow, mobilize calmly, and counterattack at leisure. Never again would French fields drown in blood. Historians still argue whether the Maginot Line was brilliant or delusional. On paper, it was nearly indestructible. Forts buried deep, guns shielded by armor, overlapping fields of fire. In practice, it was a monument to the wrong kind of imagination, because while France built downward, Germany thought forward. Still, in its own way, the line was a marvel. The forts, or ouvrages, connected by rail tunnels and telephone cables, formed a self-sufficient defensive ecosystem. Soldiers could live underground for months. The design was so advanced that later NATO planners studied it for Cold War bunkers. And for the men stationed here, morale was high.
They felt part of something grand, a literal wall between civilization and chaos. The problem wasn't the forts themselves. It was everything they represented. The Maginot Line symbolized the cult of defense that had captured France's soul. It was the physical manifestation of méthodique bataille, predictable, cautious, obsessed with preparation. Every meter of concrete whispered the same philosophy: hold, don't move. French generals believed fortifications equaled security, but security isn't strategy. The line covered only the eastern frontier, the most obvious invasion route from Germany. To the north, through Belgium, the fortifications thinned to token defenses. France assumed that any German attack would have to come through Belgium again, as in 1914. And if it did, French armies could march north and meet them there, shielded on their right flank by the Maginot forts. It was elegant, symmetrical, and utterly predictable. In 1940, the German High Command did something France's planners had dismissed as impossible. They sent their armored divisions through the Ardennes, a forested region considered too dense for tanks. The French called it terrain de sanglier, wild boar country. Not exactly ideal for mechanized warfare, or so they thought. But German engineers cleared paths, bridging rivers and widening roads in secret. Within days, entire panzer columns were pouring through the impenetrable forest. You can almost imagine the stunned French staff officers staring at maps, their fortifications silent and useless as the enemy swept around them. And here's the tragic irony. The Maginot Line worked. It held perfectly where it existed. In June 1940, some forts continued fighting even after the French government surrendered. But wars aren't won by the places that hold. They're lost by the places that fall. One quirky tidbit: the Maginot designers actually proposed extending the line along the Belgian border, but politicians refused. Why? Diplomacy. France wanted to maintain friendly relations with Belgium and feared insulting them by walling them off. So they left a gap, the very gap Hitler exploited. In that sense, the Maginot Line wasn't just a military error. It was a political compromise, a half-finished sentence pretending to be a full stop. For the soldiers stationed there, life before the war felt almost comfortable. They read newspapers, played cards, practiced drills, and believed sincerely in their safety. One veteran later said, "We felt untouchable, like the war would happen somewhere else." And that was exactly the danger. Comfort masquerading as confidence. When the invasion came in May 1940, the forts performed admirably where the Germans attacked them. At Ouvrage-Hackenberg and Schonenburg, gunners fired thousands of shells, repelling assaults for weeks. But it was all meaningless once the Wehrmacht swept past through the Ardennes. The forts became islands in a storm, bypassed and eventually isolated. Historians still debate whether France could have used the Maginot Line differently. Could it have served as an anchor for mobile defense instead of a cage? Possibly, but that would have required a different mindset, a belief that defense could support offense, not replace it. The Maginot mentality seeped into everything: doctrine, planning, even language. Officers described their strategies in architectural terms: pillars, foundations, frameworks. The vocabulary of motion had been replaced by the vocabulary of construction. There's a quietly haunting story from 1939. A young lieutenant stationed in one of the forts wrote home, describing his surroundings proudly. "We have electricity, a kitchen, even a cinema. It feels like civilization down here." His next line is chilling in hindsight. "If the war comes, I almost hope we stay underground." That's not cowardice, it's faith in a machine. Faith that safety could be engineered. But war is entropy, not architecture. You can picture the moment the illusion broke. German tanks racing across open country. French command posts frantically phoning the Maginot garrisons. "Hold your positions!" Hold what exactly? The forts weren't connected to the battle anymore. They were like old castles in a world of airplanes and radios. And still, they fought. Even after France signed the armistice on June 22, 1940, several Maginot forts refused to surrender. Ouvrage-Schonenbourg held out for nearly a week longer, continuing to fire until ordered by the government to stop. That's discipline, devotion, and futility all at once. There's something almost poetic about it. France's most durable defenses defeated not by destruction, but by irrelevance. The line also devoured France's resources. Between 1929 and 1936, it consumed roughly 3 billion francs, an enormous sum that might otherwise have gone to modernizing the Air Force or producing more mobile armored units. Critics at the time warned that concrete does not win wars. They were dismissed as alarmists. After all, didn't the line provide jobs? Didn't it reassure the public? It did both. It just didn't prepare them for reality. Still, the Maginot Line wasn't a total folly. Its construction reflected genuine genius in engineering and foresight. The real mistake was psychological, mistaking engineering for strategy, walls for will. You lean back and imagine yourself walking those underground halls today, empty now, echoes bouncing off cold walls. The paint peels, the lights flicker, the silence is heavy. It's less a fortress than a tomb of misplaced faith. Historians still argue whether France's obsession with fortifications was an act of prudence or panic. Perhaps it was both. When a nation is haunted by trauma, it doesn't build monuments to victory, it builds monuments to prevention. The Maginot Line wasn't arrogance, it was fear turned to concrete. And maybe that's the most human mistake of all, believing that what kept you safe once will keep you safe forever. By 1940, that belief would crumble faster than any wall. Because while France poured its soul into defense, its enemy poured its imagination into movement. And the next battle, the real test, would pit those two philosophies head to head. The methodical versus the mobile. The fortress versus the flow. Next, you'll step into the war rooms of doctrine, where generals argued over paper battles and refused to see that the next war would not be fought like the last. You're sitting in a smoky lecture hall at the École de Guerre, the French Army's elite training academy, in the late 1930s. The air smells of chalk dust and cigarette smoke. A colonel is pacing at the front, tapping a pointer against a wall-sized map of northern France. Lines, arrows, and color-coded zones cover the board like a mathematical equation. The colonel's voice is calm, precise, almost hypnotic. "Gentlemen," he says, "victory belongs to those who prepare with method." Around you, officers nod. Not one of them seems restless. No one dares interrupt. The methodical battle, la bataille méthodique, has become sacred doctrine. This was the French Army's Bible between the wars. The belief that wars could be won through perfect synchronization, predetermined plans, and unbreakable discipline. Chaos had nearly destroyed them at Verdun, so they swore to eliminate it forever. Every maneuver, every shot, every step had to be calculated in advance. Nothing was to be left to chance, or, heaven forbid, initiative. The result was a system that looked flawless on paper and lifeless in practice. French doctrine envisioned future wars as slow-moving slugfests between massed infantry and artillery. Tanks would advance only after the enemy was softened by hours of bombardment. Airplanes would serve mostly as scouts. Mobility, improvisation, and decentralized command. These were viewed as dangerous fantasies. Historians still argue whether la bataille méthodique was born from wisdom or fear. It certainly had logic behind it. The trauma of World War I taught France that haste led to disaster. But in trying to banish chaos, they also banished adaptability. The Germans, meanwhile, studied the same lessons and drew the opposite conclusion. They believed the Great War had shown the need for more flexibility, faster movement, constant communication, and local initiative. Where the French saw disorder, the Germans saw opportunity. Out of that mindset came Bewegungskrieg, or War of Movement, what the world would later call Blitzkrieg. You can almost imagine two mirror classrooms in 1938. In one, French officers diagramming artillery schedules to the minute. In the other, German officers practicing how to improvise when the plan collapses. One side rehearsed predictability, the other rehearsed chaos. Guess which one worked? The difference wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. French generals thought of war as a science. Germans treated it as an art. The French sought stability. The Germans sought tempo. This clash of worldviews became painfully obvious in 1940. When German tanks burst through the Ardennes and reached the Meuse, French high command refused to believe it at first. Impossible, they said. That terrain cannot support a mechanized force. Even after reports flooded in, General Gamelin insisted on confirmation multiple times before authorizing a response. In a world built on la bataille méthodique, initiative was suspicion. You didn't act until the chain of command approved, and by the time approval came, events had sprinted past. The French army's organization reflected this obsession with control. Communication lines ran vertically, never laterally. Units were expected to await orders from higher command rather than coordinate with neighbors. It was a hierarchy designed to prevent mistakes, but it also prevented miracles. One quirky but revealing rule: division commanders were forbidden to alter their objectives once battle began unless explicitly ordered. If the situation changed, well, too bad. The staff in Paris knew best. You can picture the result. While German panzers raced across Belgium and northern France, French units waited for written orders that took hours to transmit and longer to interpret. Tanks were parceled out in tiny clusters to support infantry, ensuring that no single formation had enough strength to counterattack decisively. Radios existed but were considered too undisciplined for junior officers. There's a bitter irony here. France actually had excellent tanks. The Char B-1 and Samua S-35 were superior to most German models in armor and firepower, but doctrine dictated they be spread thinly, guarding static sectors instead of massed for breakthrough. It was like owning a Ferrari and using it as a delivery truck. The French Air Force suffered a similar fate. Rather than focus on concentrated strikes, its mission was divided between reconnaissance, defensive patrols, and sporadic ground support. All pre-planned, all inflexible. When the Luftwaffe struck, coordination between air and ground collapsed almost instantly. Historians still debate whether French officers could have improvised under better leadership. Some argue that they weren't given the chance. Others point out that the culture of obedience before initiative was so ingrained that even bold commanders hesitated. There's a story from the Battle of Gembloux in May 1940 that captures it perfectly. French tanks actually stopped a German armored assault cold, the only time in the campaign that the French clearly outperformed the Wehrmacht in open battle. The Germans withdrew temporarily, bloodied and stunned. But instead of exploiting the success, the French commander halted his forces. Why? Because his orders had been to hold position, not advance. Imagine being that close to turning the tide and standing still because the paperwork said so. To the French staff, this wasn't cowardice, it was discipline. Doctrine was sacred, initiative was dangerous. But in war, sacred rules are liabilities. Even in training, officers were graded on compliance rather than creativity. Simulations punished improvisation as non-methodical. Young captains quickly learned that the surest path to promotion was never to deviate from the plan. And since the plan was built for 1918, the army of 1940 was fighting ghosts. One of those ghosts was the Bataille d'Arrêt, the Battle of Stoppage. This was the French idea of halting an enemy offensive with layered defenses and counter-battery fire, then transitioning to deliberate counterattacks. It was a doctrine made for trench warfare, not mobile thrusts. Against Blitzkrieg, it was like trying to stop a flood with sandbags neatly arranged in rows. You can't help but feel a kind of tragic admiration. The French army didn't fail for lack of thought.
It failed from too much thought. It intellectualized itself into paralysis.
Here's an odd little anecdote that drives it home. Before the war, a French staff conference debated how long it would take to mobilize and position divisions under attack. The consensus answer was 3 weeks. When one colonel suggested the enemy might not give them that much time, the room reportedly laughed. The assumption was that wars still unfolded at the pace of trains and telegrams. No one imagined radios, tanks, and dive bombers turning strategy into real-time improvisation. And yet, even as the Germans rolled westward, some French commanders clung to the methodical ideal. "We must not be provoked into premature movement," one general said as enemy armor approached. Premature? The front was already collapsing. But in a system that worshipped control, spontaneity felt like sin. Historians still debate whether the Maginot mentality and bataille méthodique were two sides of the same coin. Most agree they were, both born from Verdun's trauma, both worshipping the illusion of control. The fortresses were physical walls. The doctrine was an intellectual one. Both kept France safe, until they didn't. You can almost feel the frustration of younger officers like de Gaulle, who warned that war had become a matter of motion. "Victory will belong to the side that acts, not reacts," he wrote. But the high command saw movement as chaos, and chaos as death. They were fighting entropy with spreadsheets. And yet, the irony is that méthodique bataille wasn't entirely wrong. The Germans themselves would later suffer from overextension, the very chaos the French feared. But timing is everything. In 1940, the balance between control and flexibility decided everything. France was on the wrong side of that equation. As the lecture at the École de Guerre ends, the colonel erases his meticulous arrows and tells his students, "Gentlemen, in war there are no surprises, only unprepared minds." The room nods approvingly. Somewhere, in another classroom across the border, a German instructor is saying the exact opposite. War is surprise. Be the one who adapts first. You leave the hall and step into the twilight of a nation still haunted by its last victory and blind to the next defeat. The hum of the fan in your room tonight feels like the ticking of a clock, each second a warning France never heeded. Next, you'll meet the men who had to apply this rigid philosophy in real time. Generals out of time, whose stars shone brightly in 1918, but dimmed fatally by 1940. You stand in the shadow of an aging general's tent at the French headquarters outside Paris in early May 1940. Maps cover the tables, ashtrays overflow, and telephones buzz with fragments of panic disguised as routine. At the center of it all sits General Maurice Gamelin, the man entrusted with France's fate. His glasses glint under a weak lamp as he studies reports through a magnifying glass. Calm, methodical, detached. To his staff, he seems unshakable. To history, he will become a ghost of another war. Gamelin was a soldier of the old world. Born in 1872, he'd spent his life in uniform, brilliant in 1918, respected by all ranks, polite to a fault. But by 1940, he was 68 years old, commanding an army built for trench warfare in an age of engines and speed. His leadership was cerebral, almost academic. He loved detail, diagrams, and plans written in perfect prose. His war was a chess game. Unfortunately, the Germans were playing poker. Historians still argue about Gamelin's true role in France's collapse. Some see him as a tragic victim of impossible politics, others as a man fatally out of touch. What's certain is that his command style reflected the same obsession with order that had gripped the entire nation. He centralized everything. Subordinates were to follow procedure, not intuition. He rarely visited the front, preferring to issue directives from Vincennes far behind the lines. His subordinates later joked, darkly, that he commanded France by telephone and imagination.
You can picture him there, white-haired, dignified, a relic of the Republic's faith in reason over risk. The problem was that reason moves slowly, and war does not. At the outbreak of the invasion on May 10, 1940, Gamelin believed he understood the German plan. He expected a repeat of 1914, the main blow through Belgium, which the Allies could meet head-on. Accordingly, French and British troops advanced into Belgium under Plan D, stretching their best divisions northward. It was a textbook response to a textbook war, except this wasn't 1914, and the Germans weren't following the textbook. While Allied forces raced north to meet a phantom offensive, the real German thrust came through the Ardennes, the forest everyone thought impassable. Within days, 7 panzer divisions had pierced the French line near Sedan and were pouring westward, cutting off the Allied armies like a knife through silk. When news of the breakthrough reached Gamelin, he hesitated. His first reaction was disbelief. Impossible. It must be a feint. Reports piled up. His staff urged action. A counterattack, a shift south, something. But Gamelin demanded verification. It took almost 48 hours before he accepted the scale of the disaster. By then, the Germans had established a bridgehead across the Meuse and were racing toward the coast. You can feel the paralysis spreading from headquarters outward, like ink bleeding through paper. Corps commanders waited for new orders that never came. Divisions stood idle, unsure whether to retreat or fight. The entire command network, designed for control, collapsed under the pressure of uncertainty. The real tragedy is that Gamelin wasn't incompetent. He was cautious, dignified, and painfully human. He wanted to avoid rash mistakes, to think before acting. But war punishes hesitation more cruelly than error. Historians still debate whether his successor, General Maxime Weygand, could have done any better. Weygand was 73 when he took command, 5 years older than Gamelin. He'd served under Foch in World War I and carried himself like a soldier from a lost century. He replaced Gamelin on May 19th, by which time France was already in chaos. German armor had reached the Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. Weygand's first task was not to win the war, but to slow the dying. When Weygand arrived at headquarters, he reportedly spread a large map across the table and traced the German spearhead with his finger. "We are cut in two," he said simply. His solution was elegant but unrealistic. A massive pincer attack from north and south to crush the German corridor. On paper, it looked brilliant. In reality, the French no longer had the mobility or communication to pull it off. Still, Weygand tried. His counterattacks at Arras, Abbeville, and along the Somme showed flashes of tactical genius. French and British tanks did momentarily blunt the German advance, but the damage was done. The army was already fragmented, morale shattered. Entire units had lost radio contact, supplies, or leadership. The coordination needed for a Weygand counterstroke simply didn't exist anymore. It's tempting to imagine that younger, more dynamic generals could have changed things. But the truth is, France's senior command structure was a museum. Most of its leaders were veterans of Verdun, promoted for their steadfastness, not adaptability. They understood endurance, not velocity. Take General Georges, commander of the Northeastern Front. A man described by peers as methodical, cautious, and perpetually exhausted. Or General Korap, who oversaw the Ardennes sector. When German armor punched through his line, Korap suffered a nervous breakdown, convinced his troops had betrayed him. And then there was General Belot, charged with coordinating the French, British, and Belgian armies. He was literally hit by a truck and killed on May 21st, leaving no one in overall command at the most critical moment of the campaign. You can almost hear the sound of gears grinding in the machine. Too many old parts, too many missing pieces. And yet, amid this dysfunction, individual bravery shone. Officers at the front improvised heroically. At Stone, French tanks fought tooth and nail, recapturing the same village 17 times in 3 days. At Saumur,
Cadets from the cavalry school held the Loire bridges for days against German armor. The courage was there, the coordination was not. One of the more bizarre details of the campaign: during the Battle of France, Gamelin had no dedicated radio link between his headquarters and the British Expeditionary Force. Communications relied on telephones and motorcycle couriers. Meanwhile, German commanders were using real-time radio to adjust attacks minute by minute. In a race between telegrams and transmitters, France never stood a chance. Historians still argue whether France's generals truly believed in the doctrines they followed, or whether they simply lacked the energy to challenge them. By 1940, command posts were filled with men whose confidence had been eroded by years of political oversight. Every risk carried the fear of scandal. Every failure, the risk of inquiry. It's hard to lead boldly when every move could end your career. Even Charles de Gaulle, then a brigadier general, found himself hamstrung by this culture. He led the 4th Armored Division in several daring counterattacks, one of which actually delayed the German advance near Montcornet. For a brief moment, his aggressive tactics, fast, decisive, mobile, looked like a glimpse of what France could have been. But he lacked resources, support, and, most crucially, political backing. His superiors treated him as a reckless maverick. You can sense the generational gap. De Gaulle's tanks moved with urgency. His commanders moved with caution. He was the future, surrounded by men of the past. By the time Weygand tried to reorganize defenses along the Somme and Aisne, the army was no longer an army. It was a mosaic of fragments. Units fought valiantly, but without cohesion. Some commanders didn't even know where their neighboring divisions were. Refugees clogged the roads, blocking supply convoys. Communication lines broke down under constant bombing. It's almost poetic in a bleak way. A nation whose doctrine prized coordination disintegrated for lack of it. Even the chain of command at the highest level fractured. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, desperate and furious, clashed constantly with his generals. He wanted offensive action. They wanted negotiation. "They're killing France with caution," he fumed. On June 10th, as German tanks neared Paris, Reynaud fled south. 4 days later, Marshal Philippe Pétain, another hero from 1918, took over the government. His first instinct was not resistance, but surrender. And there it was again. The past swallowing the present. Pétain, the Lion of Verdun, symbolized the same generation that had built the Maginot Line, the same faith in fortitude over flexibility. In 1916, his stoicism had saved France. In 1940, it would bury her. When you step back, it's not hard to see the through line. France's leadership in 1940 wasn't just old, it was anchored. Anchored in memory, in doctrine, in fear of disorder. A new kind of war demanded new kinds of minds, and France's belonged to yesterday. You close your eyes and picture those generals, standing over their maps as the walls of history close in. They weren't villains. They were men who fought one apocalypse and spent the rest of their lives trying to make sure it never happened again. Unfortunately, they forgot that wars never repeat. They evolve. Next, you'll roll up your sleeves and look at the machines themselves. Tanks, rifles, and planes. How France's material strength rivaled Germany's, and how doctrine and leadership managed to waste it all. You stand ankle-deep in churned mud near Sedan, the smell of exhaust thick in the air. Tank engines growl somewhere beyond the trees, and the sky flickers with the reflection of tracer fire. This is May 1940, and for a brief, terrible moment, it seems like the machines themselves have come alive. Metal replaces muscle. Speed replaces strategy. France and Germany now test whose vision of mechanized war was right. On paper, France should have won this duel of engines. It had more tanks than Germany, better ones even. The Char B-1, an armored beast weighing 30 tons, could shrug off direct hits from most German guns. The Samua S-35 was sleek, fast, and elegant, a knight in steel. French engineers had built marvels of craftsmanship, polished, precise, and deadly at close range. If you compared armor thickness and firepower, the French army actually outclassed the Wehrmacht in nearly every category.
So why did they lose?
Historians still argue about that. Some blame tactics, others doctrine, others psychology. But everyone agrees, it wasn't the machines that failed. It was the men commanding them.
The French treated tanks as supporting actors, not stars.
They were dispersed in small packets among infantry divisions, intended to advance slowly after artillery preparation. Each armored battalion answered to an infantry commander whose job was to maintain line integrity. In practice, this meant tanks were shackled to walking speed, waiting for foot soldiers to catch up. The Germans, by contrast, massed their armor. Entire divisions of panzers spearheaded attacks, supported by mobile artillery and dive bombers. They didn't crawl, they sprinted. The French saw tanks as fortresses on tracks. The Germans saw them as cavalry. A single French Char B1 could destroy a dozen German panzers in a straight fight. But straight fights rarely happened. The Germans bypassed them, striking weak points, cutting supply lines, and isolating pockets. By the time French armor engaged, it was already surrounded.
Here's a quirky bit of battlefield irony.
Many German tanks in 1940 carried short-barreled guns that couldn't even penetrate French armor. Instead, they relied on coordination, airstrikes, artillery, and mobility to neutralize opponents. The Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stukas screamed down on French columns, scattering crews who had no air cover or communication. Bombs replaced bullets. Panic replaced firepower.
Communication, or the lack of it,
was perhaps France's greatest mechanical flaw. Most French tanks had no radios at all. Orders were passed by flag, flare, or messenger. Commanders had to physically climb out of their hatches to shout instructions. Imagine trying to choreograph a dance while wearing earplugs in a hurricane. The Germans, meanwhile, equipped nearly every panzer with radio sets. Commanders could redirect units instantly, turning confusion into fluid motion. The results were devastating. While French formations moved like separate islands, the German Panzer Corps flowed like a river, changing course, merging, splitting, and reforming as needed. Blitzkrieg wasn't just about speed, it was about unity of movement. And yet, for all this, the French tanks themselves were masterpieces of design. The Char B1 75mm hull gun could obliterate bunkers. The Somowa S-35 had sloped armor decades ahead of its time, but they were over-engineered. Mechanical thoroughbreds too complicated for wartime conditions. Their transmissions broke down, their engines overheated, their fuel consumption was monstrous. Repair crews couldn't keep pace. In the chaos of retreat, many were abandoned intact, simply out of fuel or spare parts.
Historians still debate whether this technical perfectionism reflected France's industrial temperament, craft over quantity, elegance over simplicity. The Germans built thousands of good enough machines. The French built hundreds of near-perfect ones. And war rewards volume more than artistry. There's a story, half tragic, half absurd, from the Battle of Stone. A single Char B1, commanded by Captain Billat, reportedly destroyed 13 German tanks and 2 anti-tank guns in 15 minutes. It then returned to base, armor pockmarked but intact. The next day, it broke down due to a clogged fuel line and had to be abandoned. Victory meet bureaucracy. Even ammunition logistics betrayed France. Each tank type used different shells, calibers, and cartridge casings, complicating resupply. German depots, by contrast, used standardized munitions. In the whirlwind of May 1940, every small inefficiency snowballed into paralysis. The same pattern appeared in the skies. The French Air Force wasn't weak, far from it. It possessed modern fighters like the WWII D-520, capable of matching the German Bf-109. But production had lagged, and only a few hundred were operational when the invasion began. Worse, like the army, the Air Force was divided by doctrine. Should it defend cities
Support ground troops? Attack enemy airfields? Every mission required approval from high command. By the time orders arrived, the battlefield had shifted. The Luftwaffe, under Göring, faced no such confusion. Its bombers and fighters acted as an extension of the army, eyes and fists moving in rhythm. Stukas dove in precision strikes ahead of panzers, shattering morale as much as targets. The French had the machines to respond, but not the freedom. One fringe theory among historians suggests that France's early collapse wasn't purely material or tactical. It was psychological. The Germans believed utterly in movement and victory. The French believed in procedure and prevention. When those two philosophies collided, one of them froze. You can almost imagine a French tank crew inside a cramped Char B1, sweat dripping, gears grinding, waiting for the next written order while bombs fall nearby. "Advance?" someone asks. "Not without confirmation," comes the reply. Seconds later, the road ahead is gone. Still, it would be unfair to say French soldiers lacked courage. Many fought with desperate tenacity. Pilots took off from bomb-scarred runways to challenge Luftwaffe swarms they knew outnumbered them. Tankers fought until their ammunition was gone, then scuttled their machines rather than surrender. But courage, scattered and unsupported, couldn't compensate for a system designed to suppress initiative. There's a haunting anecdote from the end of May 1940. A French armored officer reportedly radioed, "Our tanks are not inferior. Our doctrine is." That line could have been France's epitaph for the entire war. Even Britain saw the difference. British observers during the campaign noted with amazement how German units seemed to move like one mind, while French ones waited for permission to think. It wasn't that one side had better weapons. It was that one side used them better. By June, much of France's armored strength was either destroyed, captured, or abandoned. Dozens of gleaming Char B1 stood intact by the roadside, their crews gone, engines silent. The Germans later repaired and reused them under new insignia, a cruel twist, French pride painted over with black crosses. Historians still debate what might have happened if France had concentrated its armor into a few powerful divisions. If de Gaulle's ideas had been heeded, could massed French tanks have halted the Blitz? Possibly. But possibly was a word France had trained itself not to believe in. The Maginot mentality had no room for imagination. You sit quietly now, hearing the faint clatter of tank tracks fading into memory. The battlefields of 1940 are silent meadows today, their scars softened by grass and time. But under that soil lies the story of a paradox, a nation that had the tools to fight the future and the mindset to remain in the past. As one historian put it, France did not lack steel, it lacked elasticity. Next, we'll look upward to the clouds and contrails, where the struggle for France's skies mirrored the same tragedy. Brave pilots, fine planes, but an air strategy trapped in a bureaucratic fog. You tilt your head back toward a gray, cloud-streaked sky over northern France, 1940. The hum you hear isn't thunder, it's engines. Dozens, maybe hundreds, weaving vapor trails across the clouds like chalk marks on a blackboard. The battle for France's skies has begun, and once again, the duel isn't simply between machines, but between mindsets. France's air force, the Armée de l'Air, wasn't small, nor was it primitive. In fact, it was one of the oldest independent air forces in the world, established before most nations even considered airplanes more than curiosities. It had modern fighters like the WWII D520, sleek and agile, capable of matching Germany's feared Messerschmitt Bf-109 in a dogfight. There were solid bombers too, the Leo 451 and Amiot 143, the latter outdated but sturdy, like a flying brick that refused to retire. On paper, France's arsenal didn't look hopeless. So why did the Luftwaffe dominate the skies so swiftly? Historians still argue whether it was numbers, tactics, or sheer organization, but the consensus is clear. France lost control of the air not because it lacked planes, but because it lacked a unified vision of how to use them. The French command treated the Air Force as an auxiliary service, support for the army, reconnaissance for the generals, or a deterrent for politicians to wave at League of Nations meetings. Every mission had to pass through committees. In 1939, when war was declared, the Armée de l'Air was formally separated from the army for independence, but practically, it remained chained to ground directives. Contrast that with Germany. Under Hermann Göring's ruthless oversight, the Luftwaffe was a weapon of pure aggression, built for offensive coordination. It didn't just fight battles, it prepared them. Dive bombers softened targets, fighters cleared the air, reconnaissance planes fed data to tanks below. Air and ground moved as one symphony of destruction. Meanwhile, French air units were scattered like puzzle pieces. Each army group had its own attached squadrons, operating independently. Commanders hesitated to risk aircraft in mass engagements, fearing they'd waste resources. The skies above the front became empty windows through which the enemy moved freely. There's a bitter little joke among wartime pilots. We flew when the paperwork cleared. For the French, that was often literal. Orders for air support sometimes took 12 hours to process, an eternity when the battle on the ground was changing by the minute. One French squadron leader later recalled, "We had the planes, but not the permission." Still, the pilots themselves fought like lions. You can almost see them, tight leather jackets, goggles fogged, nerves steel tight, as they roar upward to meet formations of German bombers. In single engagements, WWII and Morane fighters inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe. In fact, during the first week of the invasion, French and British pilots destroyed nearly 600 German aircraft. But it didn't matter. The Luftwaffe could replace them faster than France could file a requisition form. That's another wound inflicted by bureaucracy. The French aircraft industry, as we saw earlier, was fragmented into dozens of small firms. Each built different components, one company for wings, another for engines, another for instruments. Assembly lines rarely ran at full speed. When factories were nationalized under the Société Nationale des Constructions Aéronautiques, efficiency was supposed to improve. Instead, strikes, management disputes, and production bottlenecks multiplied. In 1939, France built fewer than half the planes it had planned. A quirky anecdote captures the absurdity. One WWII factory produced wings faster than fuselages, so hundreds of wings were stored in barns awaiting completion. Somewhere in Toulouse, a French farmer literally slept above enough spare wings to equip an entire fighter group that never materialized. And then came coordination, or rather, the lack of it. During the Battle of France, French airfields were repeatedly bombed because ground forces failed to inform pilots of their new defensive lines. Squadrons would take off expecting to defend one area, only to discover their bases under attack. In one tragic case, a returning flight landed on a recently captured German-held airstrip. Historians still debate whether France could have gained air superiority, at least temporarily, if it had concentrated its squadrons early. Some argue that the Luftwaffe's strength was exaggerated, and that a unified French-British air campaign might have blunted the Blitzkrieg. But France's system wasn't built for unified anything. Each branch guarded its autonomy, and cooperation required layers of authorization that no one had time for. By late May, the picture was grim. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, its bombers cutting rail lines and strafing refugee convoys. French columns advancing northward to aid Belgium were torn apart from above. The psychological effect was devastating. Soldiers began calling every airplane overhead a German. Civilians huddled in ditches at the sound of engines, and the terror wasn't just physical, it was mental. The Stuka dive bomber, with its siren mounted on the landing gear, turned fear into a weapon. The howling descent of a Stuka wasn't just an attack, it was a broadcast of despair. French troops froze at the sound, convinced no shelter could save them. German officers later admitted the sirens were as effective as the bombs themselves. Even high command succumbed to panic. On May 15th,
German aircraft bombed Gamelin's communications hubs near Laon. The strikes severed phone lines between several divisions and headquarters. Gamelin, convinced he was being targeted personally, moved his staff further back, another few kilometers away from the front he was supposed to command. The message was clear. Even leadership no longer felt safe.
And yet, not every story ends in helplessness. Individual French pilots displayed astounding courage. One ace, Pierre Leglan, downed 5 German aircraft in a single mission over Belgium, an achievement rivaling Britain's future Battle of Britain heroes. Others continued to fly even as their bases were abandoned, refueling from highway trucks, taking off between retreating columns. Their bravery didn't fail, their system did. Here's a curious, almost forgotten episode. A squadron of Polish and Czech pilots who had fled to France fought under French colors in 1940. Many had already survived the fall of their own countries. When asked why they kept flying despite hopeless odds, one replied, "Because if we stop, Europe stops." They would later form the backbone of the Allied air forces in Britain, proving that skill and spirit mattered more than bureaucracy. The French command's final plan for air operations, drawn up in June 1940, reads almost tragic in hindsight. Continue to fight in support of ground units as long as fuel permits. That last phrase, "as long as fuel permits," is practically poetry of collapse. Still, you can't help feeling sympathy. The Armée de l'Air wasn't lazy or cowardly. It was born in a culture that feared recklessness more than defeat. France wanted control in everything: its government, its military, even its clouds. And clouds, as any pilot will tell you, don't stay still. By mid-June, the skies above France belonged entirely to the Luftwaffe. German planes hunted retreating columns with impunity. Airfields burned. Mechanics smashed their own engines with sledgehammers to keep them from capture. When the armistice came, hundreds of French aircraft were still intact, but grounded, silent, wings folded against the inevitability of surrender. Historians still debate whether things could have been different. Could France have fought a Battle of France in the air the way Britain would soon fight its own? Perhaps if it had embraced risk, concentrated power, and trusted its pilots. But the thought of chaos, of boldness without approval, was something French command could never quite stomach. You imagine standing on a quiet field near Tours as dusk settles in June 1940. Charred hangars, scattered helmets, a few wrecked fighters glinting in the fading sun. The air smells of gasoline and failure. Overhead, the distant growl of German bombers fades toward the west. The sky is theirs now. And yet, even in defeat, those French pilots left a legacy. Many escaped to North Africa or England, joining the Free French forces under de Gaulle. They would fly again, over Libya, over the Channel, over the ruins of their own homeland. The lesson they carried wasn't about machines or tactics. It was about freedom, the freedom to act without waiting for permission. Next, you'll drop back to the ground, where fear, confusion, and rumor began to tear France apart from within faster than bombs or bullets ever could. You're standing on a French country road in late May 1940. The smell of smoke and petrol clings to the air. Around you, chaos unfolds like a slow-motion nightmare. Wagons, bicycles, cars piled high with mattresses, children crying, soldiers marching the wrong way. The line between army and civilian has vanished into a river of panic flowing south. Somewhere, a cow moos miserably, tied to the back of a truck stacked with furniture. The German offensive hasn't just broken France's defenses, it's broken its nerves. This was the other battlefield, the invisible one, the collapse of morale. On paper, the French army still had over 2 million men under arms in early June. In theory, many units were intact. In reality, the nation's will had already disintegrated. Rumors spread faster than tanks. Radios sputtered contradictory reports. Newspapers printed optimism one morning and despair the next. Civilians fled before they even saw an enemy. Historians still argue what truly caused this psychological implosion. Some say it was the shock of Blitzkrieg, the sheer speed and confusion of a new kind of war. Others point to the deeper rot, 2 decades of pessimism, political division, and fear of another Verdun. Whatever the cause, the result was paralysis. France didn't just lose its defenses, it lost its faith. You can feel it in the letters soldiers wrote home. One private scribbled, "We are fighting ghosts, not men." Another, "The sky is full of their planes, and our officers tell us to wait." Waiting became the disease of 1940. It wasn't that the French soldiers lacked courage. At Dunkirk, at Stone, at Lille, they fought bravely, often holding out against impossible odds. The problem was that bravery without belief is just survival instinct. When the men at the front sensed the people behind them were already giving up, their own resolve began to crack. Imagine being a 20-year-old conscript crouched in a ditch, artillery shaking the ground, and hearing that the government in Paris is evacuating south. You start wondering, if they're leaving, why are we still here? That question spread like infection. The civilian panic made things worse. By the 3rd week of May, northern France was choking on refugees, an estimated 8 million people on the move. Entire towns emptied overnight, roads clogged with wagons, carts, and automobiles, slowing military convoys to a crawl. German planes strafed the columns, not always to kill, but to scatter, to terrify. Soldiers trying to advance found themselves trapped behind miles of terrified civilians. One French officer later described it as a nation dissolving before our eyes. The government's handling of the crisis didn't help. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud begged his ministers to project confidence, but half of them were already urging peace. Rumors swirled that Britain would abandon France, that the Germans were already in Paris, that entire armies had surrendered. Most of it was false, but in panic, perception becomes reality. One quirky but telling detail: when the Germans captured the city of Amiens, French radio continued to broadcast reports that it was still holding firm for 3 more days. The soldiers defending nearby sectors, hearing that lie, began doubting everything else they were told. And fear has a sound, the low, steady hum of retreat. You can almost hear it. Boots shuffling south, truck engines sputtering, whispered questions in the dark. Where's the line? Who's in command? Often, no one knew. This atmosphere infected even high command. Gamelin's staff, already paralyzed by doctrine, now operated under emotional siege. Officers began snapping at each other, blaming allies, mistrusting reports. The German advance didn't just slice through defenses, it sliced through trust. Historians still debate whether France's morale could have held if leadership had been clearer. There were moments when a single decision might have rallied resistance. The counterattack at Arras, for example, briefly stunned the Germans. The evacuation at Dunkirk proved Allied soldiers could still escape annihilation. But while the British turned Dunkirk into a legend, the French treated it like a failure. Their narrative was one of loss, not endurance. Even propaganda betrayed defeatism. Government posters urged citizens to hold firm, but the tone was pleading, not defiant. When people heard "hold firm," they thought, for how long? The church bells that once rang for victory in 1918 now tolled for evacuation. In Paris, families queued at gas stations and train depots. The smell of fear was everywhere. Burning papers, stale sweat, gasoline. Clerks shredded archives. Bankers sealed vaults. And even museum curators packed crates of art. The Mona Lisa was quietly loaded onto a truck bound for the Loire Valley, as if France herself was trying to smuggle her soul out before the end. In some places, the collapse bordered on surreal. When German tanks reached the outskirts of one northern town, the mayor greeted them at City Hall with flowers, believing cooperation would save lives. Elsewhere, crowds lined the roads to watch German convoys pass, silent, numb, as if watching a natural disaster roll by. There's a haunting anecdote from a captured French officer. When asked by a German interrogator why his unit hadn't resisted longer, he simply said, "It seemed useless." That quiet fatalism, the sense that nothing could change fate, was the real weapon of 1940. And yet, among the ruins of morale, there were flickers of defiance. In Lille, a surrounded French force of 40,000 held out against the Germans for 4 days, allowing the British to complete the Dunkirk evacuation. Their commander, General Molinier, refused to surrender until ammunition ran out. When captured, even the German general saluted him. But those small acts of valor vanished under the larger tide of despair. Once the French army's flanks were broken, retreat turned to rout. Divisions melted away. Some soldiers discarded their rifles and joined the refugee columns, indistinguishable from civilians. For a brief, terrible week in June, the front ceased to exist. Fear also spread downward through command. Officers who still believed in fighting found themselves isolated, even resented. At one point, Charles de Gaulle tried rallying scattered units for a counterattack near Montcornet. His own superiors accused him of insubordination. De Gaulle later said, "France was beaten not by the enemy's tanks, but by its own doubts." That doubt came from everywhere. From the memory of Verdun, from years of political feuding, from leaders who confused peace with safety. A generation raised on the promise of never again couldn't comprehend that again had already arrived. There's a darkly humorous anecdote, if you can call it that, about a French staff officer in 1940 who carried a framed photo of his Maginot bunker on his desk. When told it had been bypassed, he sighed and said, "At least it worked where it was." That's how deep the denial ran. By June, even radio broadcasts took on a strange tone, half practical, half funereal. The government issued calm-sounding orders: evacuate in an orderly fashion, carry minimal luggage, leave room for troops. But the troops were evacuating too. You can almost picture it. An elderly couple walking beside a farm cart, a soldier hitching a ride, a priest pushing a bicycle, the horizon glowing orange from burning fuel depots. Overhead, the constant whine of Luftwaffe planes, a column of history itself in retreat. Historians still debate whether morale could have been salvaged if France had done what Britain later did: refuse surrender, regroup overseas, fight on. The will existed in pockets, among de Gaulle's Free French, among colonial forces, among civilians who burned bridges rather than leave them for the enemy. But the center had already broken. Paris fell not with a fight, but with resignation. And yet, even in defeat, some lessons endure. Panic is contagious, but so is courage. If France's collapse teaches anything, it's that morale doesn't live in numbers or weapons, it lives in belief. Lose that, and even the strongest army becomes a ghost. As you stand there on that crowded road, you feel the hum of engines and the weight of silence after they pass. The war isn't over yet, but for France, the spirit that once shouted, "Ils ne passeront pas," has become a whisper. Ils sont déjà là. Next, you'll follow the final act of the campaign, the moment when the German gamble paid off completely. Sedan, Dunkirk, and the unstoppable march that turned France's nightmare into Europe's new reality. It's dawn on May 10th, 1940. You stand on a grassy ridge near the Meuse River, the mist curling low over the trees. Birds scatter as a faint rumble grows in the distance, a mechanical thunder that feels like the world itself turning over. Within hours, the German offensive begins. Soldiers of the Wehrmacht move like an iron tide, engines coughing, boots pounding, propellers cutting the air. Blitzkrieg isn't just a tactic, it's a storm, and France is directly in its path. For months, the French High Command had been certain they knew where the blow would fall. Through Belgium, they said confidently, just as in 1914. That's where the Allied armies, French, British, and Belgian, rushed to meet the invasion. They were half right. The German plan, codenamed Fall Gelb, did send a decoy force into Belgium, luring the Allies north. But the real strike came further south, through the Ardennes, that wooded, hilly region everyone had called impassable for tanks. Historians still debate whether the Germans were daring or desperate. After all, sending a mechanized army through a forest meant gambling that the French wouldn't react fast enough to crush it. But the gamble paid off, spectacularly. In just 3 days, the German columns broke out of the trees and reached the Meuse. The key point was Sedan, a sleepy riverside town that would become the pivot of the entire war. French defenses there were thin, second-rate divisions, poorly equipped, under confused command. They weren't cowards, just unprepared. When the German panzers arrived, supported by screaming Stukas overhead, the effect was electric. The ground literally trembled as dive bombers dropped with their sirens wailing. French soldiers, huddled in foxholes, said the sound tore the sky open. For 3 days, the Luftwaffe bombed Sedan without pause. More than 3,000 sorties. One French officer later described it as the end of the world in daylight. Communication lines snapped. Trenches caved in. Morale evaporated. When German tanks finally crossed pontoon bridges under cover of smoke, resistance had already broken. At headquarters, reports flooded in, first of heavy bombing, then of enemy crossing, and finally of collapse. General Hunziker, in charge of the sector, couldn't believe it. He asked for confirmation, and while he waited, the Germans advanced another 10 kilometers. It was here that Blitzkrieg revealed its real power. Not just speed, but confusion. The French army was built for clarity, front lines, orders, timetables. The Germans brought chaos, and chaos devoured organization like fire through dry grass. The 55th Infantry Division, defending Sedan, fought bravely but was overwhelmed. Some units simply dissolved under bombardment. Others retreated in good order, only to be strafed on open roads. Panic spread faster than news. By May 14th, the Meuse line was gone. At that moment, France still had a chance. A massive armored counterattack could have sealed the breach. Generals like de Gaulle and Flavigny pleaded for permission to strike the German spearhead before it reached the open plains beyond the river. But Gamelin hesitated, still convinced this was a diversion. Orders were delayed, revised, rescinded. When the counterattacks finally came, they were too small, too late. On May 15th, de Gaulle led one such assault near Montcornet. His tanks advanced boldly, catching German columns by surprise and destroying dozens of vehicles. It was one of the few moments of genuine success for France, but without support on either flank, he was forced to withdraw. It was a battle fought by ghosts, he later said, each army unable to see the other. Meanwhile, the main German thrust surged west toward the English Channel. Behind them, confusion reigned. Refugees clogged every road. French units retreated without knowing where to go. Some commanders tried forming new defensive lines, but the enemy was already behind them. The speed of it all defied comprehension. One historian compared it to a chess player realizing halfway through the game that the rules have changed. By May 20th, the Germans reached Abbeville, barely 10 days after the offensive began. The Northern Allied armies, some 400,000 British and French troops, were now trapped between the Channel and the German line. What followed was Dunkirk, an evacuation born of disaster that somehow became legend. The French army fought ferociously around Dunkirk to protect the beaches. Units at Lille, Calais, and Gravelines held out to the last bullet, buying time for the evacuation. The British called it Operation Dynamo. The French called it the Sacrifice. While hundreds of thousands escaped to England, tens of thousands of French soldiers stayed behind to fight hopeless battles, knowing surrender was inevitable. Even as Dunkirk unfolded, German tanks continued southward. The new French commander, Weygand, tried to organize a counter-offensive. He envisioned a grand pincer movement to cut off the German spearhead, much like Napoleon might have planned. A beautiful, symmetrical idea on paper, but the army was too shattered to execute it. Most divisions lacked fuel, ammunition, even clear orders. And every time a new line was drawn on a map, German panzers were already beyond it. You can imagine the despair at headquarters. Radios blaring with overlapping messages, telephones ringing unanswered, typewriters clicking pointlessly. France's command structure, built for measured deliberation, was drowning in real-time chaos. Weygand himself admitted privately, "I am fighting ghosts and smoke." Still, the French didn't stop resisting. The battles of the Somme and Aisne in early June were desperate but fierce. New divisions, many composed of reservists and colonial troops, fought tenaciously. At Montmirail and Rethel, French soldiers counterattacked, proving that courage hadn't vanished. But courage couldn't reverse momentum. And then came the final blow. Italy declared war on June 10th. Mussolini, smelling blood, wanted a piece of the spoils. French border troops, already exhausted, now had to face attacks from the Alps too. The noose was tightening. On June 13th, the French government declared Paris an open city, meaning it wouldn't be defended to spare it destruction. By the next morning, German motorcycle units were patrolling the Champs-Élysées. The Eiffel Tower remained standing, indifferent and silent, its iron frame now casting a shadow over swastika flags. Historians still debate whether France could have held out longer. The answer depends on what holding out means. Militarily, yes, parts of the army were still fighting. Politically and psychologically, no. The country's leaders were already preparing for surrender. At Compiègne, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918, Hitler now dictated France's humiliation. On June 22nd, the armistice was signed. France was split in two, the occupied north and the free zone in the south, ruled by Marshal Pétain's collaborationist government. The war that was supposed to be safe and methodical had ended in 6 weeks, but the speed of France's fall wasn't just a military event. It was a moral earthquake. Across the world, democracies trembled. If France, with its armies, its fortresses, its pride, could collapse so swiftly, what hope did anyone else have? Britain braced for invasion. The United States took notice. The world had witnessed not just a defeat, but the death of an illusion. That strength on paper equals strength in spirit. You can almost hear the eerie quiet that followed. After 6 weeks of thunder and flame, silence settled over the ruins. The roads still smelled of gasoline and dust. The airfields littered with wreckage. The countryside littered with burnt-out tanks whose crews had long fled or fallen. The Blitzkrieg had passed like a storm, leaving behind a landscape of disbelief. And yet, amid the ashes, a few voices refused silence. Charles de Gaulle escaped to London, broadcasting a call to arms. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. Most Frenchmen never heard it at the time, but history would remember. The Germans had gambled and won. They had risked everything on a plan that could easily have failed. But luck, speed, and France's own hesitation made it unstoppable. The line that had begun at Sedan ended on the Channel coast, carving through Europe's old order like a blade through parchment. You stand there now, in imagination, by that same river at Sedan. The water moves lazily under the bridge, rebuilt after the war. Children play on the banks where tanks once burned. The air is peaceful, almost too peaceful. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo, the hum of engines, the whistle of bombs, and the quiet, steady crumble of a nation that thought it was safe behind walls of concrete and doctrine. Next, you'll follow the defeated leaders of France to Compiègne, where the armistice brought not peace but humiliation, and where the ghost of 1918 returned for revenge. It's June 22nd, 1940. The forest of Compiègne is quiet, too quiet for what's about to happen. Sunlight filters through the trees, dappling the clearing with a soft, indifferent glow. In the center stands a railway carriage, plain, gray, unremarkable. Yet everyone here knows it's not just a train car, it's a stage. 22 years earlier, in this exact spot, Germany had signed its humiliation at the end of the First World War. Now, Adolf Hitler has returned to reverse the script. You can almost feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. French envoys wait stiffly outside, their uniforms immaculate, but their faces hollow. General Charles Hunziker, representing what remains of the French army, fidgets with his gloves. Across from him, German officers murmur quietly, glancing toward the path where Hitler will appear. The scene has been choreographed down to the last detail. At 3:15 p.m., Hitler steps into the clearing. He doesn't speak to anyone. He simply stands before the carriage, hands clasped behind his back, gazing at it in silence. Witnesses said he smiled, just faintly, but enough to chill the blood. For him, this moment is personal. In 1918, he had been a young corporal in the trenches, hearing the news of Germany's surrender with tears of rage. Now he's the one dictating terms. The tables haven't just turned. They've spun full circle. He enters the carriage first, followed by his generals. The French delegation follows a few minutes later. The air inside is stifling. Hitler refuses to sit. He lets his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, read the armistice conditions aloud. The message is clear: humiliation, not negotiation. France will be divided. The northern and western regions, including Paris, will fall under direct German occupation. The south will remain nominally free, governed from Vichy under Marshal Philippe Pétain. The French army will be disarmed, its navy neutralized, its colonies isolated. Hunziker listens in silence. When Ribbentrop finishes, Hitler simply nods and leaves. He doesn't wait for the French reply. Outside, he pauses once more in the clearing, turns to his staff, and says quietly, "This is the most beautiful moment of my life." Then he drives away, leaving others to handle the paperwork. Historians still debate whether this ceremony was necessary or pure theater. Strategically, Germany already had France at its mercy, but Hitler understood symbolism. He wanted to erase the memory of 1918, to turn France's greatest victory into its deepest wound. The same carriage that had once represented liberation now became an altar of defeat. Inside, Hunziker signs. His hand trembles slightly. The armistice takes effect 2 days later. France is split in two. North of the demarcation line lies the occupied zone, under German control. South of it, the Free Zone, ruled by Pétain from the spa town of Vichy. The name sounds almost gentle, but free is a cruel joke. Every decision in Vichy still requires Berlin's approval. Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, becomes head of state. At 84, he is frail but venerated, a symbol of endurance from a bygone war. "I give France my person to lessen her suffering," he declares in a radio address. His voice, slow and paternal, comforts many. Exhausted citizens want peace, not pride. They believe Pétain will protect them. In truth, he will serve the occupier more than the nation. You can picture it, an old man signing decrees under the gaze of German envoys, convinced he's saving what little remains. Vichy calls itself the National Revolution, promising renewal through discipline and morality. But beneath the rhetoric lies submission. Collaboration replaces resistance. Historians still argue how much of this was pragmatism and how much ideology. Some claim Pétain truly believed cooperation could preserve French sovereignty. Others see betrayal, a regime more eager to please Berlin than protect its people. Either way, the result is the same. France's proud republic dissolves into compliance. Ordinary life under occupation quickly becomes a balancing act. In the north, German troops patrol the streets, requisitioning food and fuel. Signs appear in both languages. Curfews are imposed. Parisians learn to live under the swastika fluttering from the Eiffel Tower. Yet, strangely, the city doesn't burn. It sighs. Cafes reopen. Newspapers print under censorship. and people learned the art of pretending. Better collaboration than starvation, some whisper. Others keep their heads down and wait for the storm to pass. One quirky but chilling anecdote. In 1941, a German officer reportedly complained that Parisian waiters still served him bad wine out of quiet protest. It was a small rebellion, but in a country where defiance could cost your life, even watered-down Burgundy became an act of resistance. Meanwhile, the Vichy regime in the south drapes itself in Catholic piety and slogans of work, family, fatherland. Street names honoring revolutionary heroes are replaced with those celebrating obedience. Political opponents disappear. Jewish citizens are gradually stripped of rights through Vichy's own decrees. No German pressure required. It's collaboration with a polite accent. And yet, not everyone accepts it. Scattered groups of officers, students, and civilians begin whispering about defiance. In London, Charles de Gaulle broadcast through the BBC, his voice crisp and steady. Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not and will not die. Few hear him that first night, but word spreads by mouth, by rumor, by hope. Still, for now, France is numb. You can almost see the country as a body after trauma, half paralyzed, half functioning, surviving but not living. The occupied north sends its grain and coal to Germany. The unoccupied south becomes a mirror of itself, governed by nostalgia and fear. The Maginot Line, once the pride of the Republic, lies silent and useless, its guns pointing at nothing. In a quiet twist of fate, some Maginot forts continue to resist even after the armistice. One garrison at Ouvrage-Schonenbourg fires its last shells days after the ceasefire, unaware that France has surrendered. When the order finally reaches them, the soldiers weep, not from cowardice but from disbelief. They had done everything right, everything by the book, and still, it hadn't mattered. Historians still debate whether France's surrender was inevitable. Could the government have fled to North Africa and continued the fight from there? Technically, yes. The French Navy and colonial empire were still intact. A few ministers even proposed it, but Pétain refused. He saw resistance as futility, not duty. And so, with a single signature, the oldest republic in Europe bowed its head. In the months that followed, humiliation became routine. French soldiers marched into captivity, nearly 2 million of them. Civilians learned to ration, to queue, to whisper. Radio stations blared German marches, and collaborationist newspapers urged obedience. France is being reborn through order, they claimed. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The rebirth was a burial. There's a grim kind of poetry in how history repeats. In 1918, the Allies had made Germany sign in Compiègne to remind it of its guilt. In 1940, Hitler made France sign there to remind it of its weakness. Both times, humiliation planted the seeds of the next war. You can imagine that forest today. Peaceful, green, birds singing above the same clearing. The railway carriage is gone. It was destroyed by the SS in 1945 to prevent it from ever becoming a monument again. But if you stand there long enough, you might still feel the ghost of that moment. The shame, the silence, the turning of history's wheel. France had fallen, but not forever. Beneath the ashes, new fires were already flickering. In the alleys of Paris, in the hills of the Auvergne, in the exiles of London. The story wasn't over, but for now, in June 1940, the nation that once terrified Europe lay divided, defeated, and disillusioned. You close your eyes, and for a second, you can almost hear the creak of that railway carriage door closing, sealing the chapter. Next, you'll step away from the battlefield and the signing tables to consider what might have been. How tiny choices and alternate paths could have changed everything, and how France's defeat still fuels one of history's great what-ifs. You're sitting at a small wooden table, half-empty coffee mug beside you, staring at a map of Europe that looks like a shattered mirror. France, once the centerpiece of the continent, has been split in two. The ink lines between occupied and free zones snake across the paper like scars. Outside, the radio murmurs Pétain's latest appeal for calm, his voice old, paternal, resigned. And you start to wonder, was it inevitable? Did France have to fall so fast, so hard? Or was there a different path, one the nation simply refused to walk? Historians have asked that question ever since the summer of 1940. The answers form a kaleidoscope of what-ifs, shifting with every new document, every memoir, every hindsight theory. Some say the defeat was baked in from the start, structural, psychological, generational. Others insist it could have been avoided with just a few decisive choices. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between destiny and neglect. Let's play out those alternate paths for a moment. What if France had struck first? After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, France declared war, but did almost nothing. The so-called phony war stretched from autumn to spring, a long yawn between disaster and denial. French troops sat behind the Maginot Line, while German forces were bogged down in the east. Historians still debate this moment. Could a French offensive across the Rhine have changed everything? In theory, yes. In practice, the army wasn't ready, and neither was the public. The trauma of World War I had buried the appetite for initiative. Politicians feared casualties more than defeat. As one French general later sighed, "We declared war without declaring the will to fight." Germany's western defenses were thin. A bold strike in late 1939 might have forced Hitler to divide his attention, perhaps even slowed his Polish campaign. Instead, France waited, and waiting turned into habit. What if France had built differently? The Maginot Line was an engineering marvel, but a strategic blindfold. Had France spent even half that budget on mobile divisions and air power, it might have fielded an army able to respond to Blitzkrieg on its own terms. The generals knew tanks were powerful. They just refused to believe they could replace artillery as the spear of war. De Gaulle's proposals for armored corps were rejected not for lack of merit, but because they offended tradition. The tank, one committee noted, is an auxiliary arm, not an independent weapon. But imagine if France had listened. Imagine 20 mechanized divisions massed behind the Ardennes, ready to counterattack the moment German armor broke through. The entire campaign might have lasted weeks longer, long enough for British reinforcements, for American pressure, for Hitler's luck to run out. What if politics hadn't strangled strategy? The Third Republic's revolving door governments turned long-term planning into a joke. Every new cabinet reshuffled priorities, replaced generals, renegotiated budgets. There was no continuity, only constant reevaluation. By 1939, the Army's rearmament program had changed hands so often that contracts overlapped and resources vanished into paperwork. A stable leadership, left or right, might have streamlined production, unified doctrine, and imposed accountability. But France's democracy, weakened by ideological wars between fascists and communists, couldn't even agree on the color of patriotism. What if the French spirit had been less afraid of ghosts? This may be the hardest question of all. Verdun haunted everything. It taught the army that caution was wisdom, that patience was virtue, that control was survival. But wars don't repeat like theater plays. By 1940, the French mindset still lived in trenches while the Germans lived in motion. A single generation's trauma had ossified into national policy. Better safe than sorry became better slow than daring. And in war, slow is sorry. Yet the alternate France you imagine isn't some mythic superpower. It's just a nation that trusted its future more than its fears. One where commanders used radios freely, where tanks weren't leashed to infantry, where officers were encouraged to act, not ask. A France that believed initiative wasn't insubordination, but intelligence. Even small decisions might have tipped the scales. Had Gamelin reacted instantly to the Meuse crossings, sending reserves, authorizing counterattacks, risking imperfection, the German bridgeheads might have been crushed before they stabilized. One historian compared it to a door left ajar that no one bothered to close. By the time anyone noticed, the house was full of thieves. And what if France had refused surrender altogether, had evacuated its government and navy to North Africa? The empire stretched from Casablanca to Indochina. French forces there were intact, well supplied, and loyal. Britain begged them to continue the fight from Algiers. A government in exile might have rallied colonies, preserved legitimacy, even joined the Allies sooner. Instead, Pétain's Vichy regime locked itself into collaboration, convincing millions that survival mattered more than dignity. Historians still argue why that choice was made. Some blame age and fatalism. Pétain was 84 and saw surrender as mercy. Others point to class resentment, elites who feared social revolution more than foreign occupation. Whatever the reason, it turned defeat into doctrine. There's a strange paradox here. France, the birthplace of modern revolution, met its greatest crisis not with rebellion, but resignation. A people who once stormed Bastilles now queued obediently for ration cards. But history isn't uniform. Within that surrender were the seeds of future defiance. Imagine if you could walk the streets of occupied Paris in 1941. At first glance, everything looks calm. Cafes open, trams running, posters urging order. Yet beneath the surface, something stirs. Secret presses print leaflets denouncing the occupiers. School teachers quietly replace Nazi propaganda with lines from Victor Hugo. Railway workers sabotage freight trains by losing bolts and brakes. France's spirit isn't dead. It's hiding, learning patience again. But this time, not the Verdun kind. The resistance would grow from those small acts, knitting together communists, Catholics, royalists, and Republicans in an unlikely alliance of necessity. But that's the next story. In 1940, all of that lay unseen, like a seed under rubble. There's a fringe debate among military historians, a butterfly theory of the fall. They argue that even with better leadership or tactics, France still would have struggled. Its population was aging, its economy sluggish, its politics divided. Blitzkrieg exploited not just geography, but tempo. Maybe no democracy could have matched Germany's militarized mania in 1940. Still others counter that fatalism is hindsight disguised as wisdom. Great nations aren't doomed by structure alone. They're doomed when they stop believing they can change it. Perhaps that's the ultimate what if. What if France had remembered the other lesson of Verdun? Not fear, but endurance. Verdun wasn't won by hiding behind walls. It was won by refusal. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The phrase became prophecy reversed in 1940. You lean back, the fan's soft hum filling the silence. The more you trace these threads, the clearer the pattern becomes. France didn't lose because it lacked strength. It lost because it mistook safety for strength. Its leaders built a fortress around yesterday and left the door to tomorrow unlocked. Still, it's impossible not to feel compassion. The men who made those choices weren't villains. They were human beings terrified of making the wrong move. After one world war that killed a generation, their greatest fear was another. And in trying to prevent tragedy, they invited it back. Historians still debate. Students still write essays. Documentaries still reanimate those 6 weeks of collapse. But maybe the lesson isn't about tanks or treaties at all. Maybe it's simpler and far more universal. When fear governs strategy, defeat becomes self-fulfilling. Next, you'll leave the realm of speculation and return to reflection, to the aftermath and the lessons carved into Europe's memory. How France's fall became a warning to the world about pride, preparation, and the price of standing still. The war is over now, or at least the part that France fought on its own soil. The guns have fallen silent, the trenches replaced by checkpoints, and the tricolor flag lowered under the weight of its own shadow. What remains is reflection, the quiet reckoning that follows every collapse. You sit by an open window in the summer heat of 1940, the smell of dust and smoke still hanging in the air. The question isn't how France fell anymore, it's why it didn't have to. In hindsight, the story feels almost scripted, a nation armed to the teeth, undone from within. But history rarely moves in straight lines. It circles, folds, hides its meaning until long after the fact. And what happened to France in 1940 wasn't just a military failure. It was a warning written in the ruins of certainty. For 2 decades, France had told itself a comforting story. It was the story of reason triumphing over risk, of science mastering chaos, of fortresses protecting peace. But wars aren't won by walls or arithmetic. They're won by imagination, by the ability to adapt faster than fear.
France's tragedy was that it forgot how to imagine victory.
Its economy, its politics, its army, all were rooted in nostalgia. The politicians dreamed of the Third Republic's stability. The generals dreamed of Verdun's glory. The citizens dreamed of safety that no longer existed. They built a country around the memory of survival instead of the pursuit of strength. And when the future came roaring through the Ardennes, no one recognized it. Historians still argue about what lesson the world should take from that moment. Some say it proves that democracies are too slow to respond to crises. Others say it proves that fear, not freedom, was France's undoing. The truth is more human and more humbling. France lost because it tried to fight inevitability with routine, danger with procedure, destiny with paperwork. The Maginot Line was only the visible part of a deeper wall, a mental fortress built to keep uncertainty out. Inside that fortress, everything felt safe. The plans, the committees, the comfort of believing that preparation was the same as readiness. But outside, the world was changing too fast for walls to matter. One French officer, reflecting years later, said, "We had the best defenses in the world against the last war." It's a line that could apply to any generation, convinced it's learned the final lesson. The irony is that France had all the raw materials of victory. Its soldiers were brave, its engineers brilliant, its resources vast. Its tanks and artillery were, in many cases, superior to Germany's. Even its air force, though disorganized, had moments of brilliance. What it lacked wasn't muscle, it was movement. The will to take initiative, to risk imperfection for momentum. And that, perhaps, is the heart of the story. Caution protects you until it paralyzes you. The collapse of 1940 isn't just a French story. It's a mirror for every nation that confuses stability with security. It's the same mistake civilizations have made for thousands of years, to build comfort into a shield, to mistake preparation for resilience, to assume the next threat will look like the last. You can almost see it from above. Armies marching in perfect formation, straight into a hurricane of innovation. But the story doesn't end in defeat. Out of the rubble, a different kind of France would rise. The resistance, born from whispers and smuggled leaflets, became the pulse of defiance. De Gaulle's lonely broadcast from London grew into a rallying cry. By 1944, French soldiers and partisans were marching alongside allies, liberating their own capital. The same streets that had once echoed with German boots now rang with the cry, "Vive la France." It's tempting to see that as redemption, but in truth, it was rebirth. The France of 1944 wasn't the same as the France of 1940. It had been forced to shed illusions, to rediscover the difference between comfort and courage. Historians still debate what changed most after the fall. Some point to military reform, the embrace of mobility and innovation. Others to political reform, the shift toward unity over factionalism. But the real change was psychological. The myth of infallibility had died, replaced by a fragile but real humility. That humility is why the story of 1940 still matters. It's easy to mock the Maginot mentality, to laugh at bureaucrats signing triplicate orders while tanks rolled past. But every generation builds its own Maginot Lines. Mental, economic, digital. Every society tells itself it's safe because it's organized. And then history knocks, asking whether we still remember how to improvise. Maybe that's why the fall of France still fascinates the world. It wasn't just a defeat of armies. It was the failure of imagination in an age that demanded creativity. It showed that brilliance without adaptability is just intelligence waiting to fail. And yet, there's something almost noble in France's stubbornness. In refusing to embrace recklessness, they were clinging to sanity in a world gone mad. The tragedy is that they mistook control for strength. And when the moment came, strength required letting go. You picture it now. The ruins of a bunker in the Ardennes, moss growing over its concrete, silence where once there was chaos. Inside, a rusted helmet, a torn map, perhaps a cigarette tin left behind. Everything physical decays, but the lesson endures. France's fall became Europe's awakening. Britain learned speed and flexibility. The United States, watching from afar, began modernizing its forces. Even Germany, for all its triumph, learned arrogance from victory and paid for it in the end. The world, in a strange way, was reshaped by 6 weeks of failure. You take a deep breath. The air tonight feels still, almost heavy with history. Maybe the lesson isn't just about nations. Maybe it's about people, too. Because in every life, there comes a moment when you must choose between the safety of the known and the risk of the new, when you can either build walls or bridges. France chose the wall, and it broke. But in breaking, it taught the rest of us to move. The night is quiet now, the fan humming softly in the corner. The roads of France are empty again. No more refugee columns, no more sirens. Just the whisper of the wind brushing over old battlefields, where grass hides the scars of tanks and shells. The war has become memory, the memory a story, and the story a lesson. You lean back, close your eyes, and picture the river at Sedan, the hills of the Ardennes, the silent halls of the Maginot Line. The men who once stood there are gone, but their choices linger, their fears, their faith, their fatal patience. It's strange, isn't it, how history feels both distant and intimate at once. You can see the ghosts of 1940 everywhere, in boardrooms that fear change, in governments that trade courage for consensus, in people who mistake routine for control. We all build our own Maginot Lines, thinking they'll keep chaos out. They never do, but maybe that's the mercy of it. Because the moment safety fails, imagination returns. The moment the fortress falls, movement begins. France discovered that truth in pain, but from that pain came rebirth, a nation humbled, wiser, still proud. So, as you drift toward sleep, remember this: walls crumble, systems fail, certainty dissolves, but resilience begins the moment we admit we don't have control. The same lesson that rebuilt France after 1940 can rebuild anyone who's ever been blindsided by life's storms. Now, breathe. Let the past fade into the hum of the night. The story's over, the lesson learned. And tomorrow, just like France, you begin again.